Ilorun city was a very busy and noisy city where tall buildings touched the sky, cars moved day and night without rest, phones rang everywhere, and people chased money, success, and respect as if tomorrow would not wait for anyone. Yet right in the middle of this modern city stood the royal palace, large and shining, mixing old tradition with new life, because even though the city had changed, the kingdom still held tightly to its crown, its rules, and its pride. Inside this palace lived Queen Adesewa, a woman many people admired from far and near, not only because she was beautiful in face and dress, but because she walked with calm strength, spoke with wisdom, and carried herself like someone who understood pain, patience, and responsibility. And every time she appeared in public, people whispered that she was the kind of queen every land prayed for, because she respected tradition but also understood the modern world her people now lived in. Queen Adesewa spent her days moving through the palace halls, checking on palace matters, listening to advisors, and sometimes watching the city from her balcony, where she could see traffic lights blinking, people rushing to work, and young ones dreaming big dreams. And even though she lived among gold, guards, and comfort, her heart was always thinking about how to keep the palace respected in a city where temptation, gossip, and pressure never slept. Serving inside this palace were many maids, young women from different poor parts of the city who woke up before sunrise, cleaned endlessly, kept secrets they were never meant to hear, and learned very early that palace life was beautiful on the outside but heavy on the inside, because one mistake in such a place could destroy a whole life. And among these maids was Zainab, a quiet girl who worked with her head down, spoke little, and believed that if she did her job well and stayed invisible, life would be kind to her one day. At the top of this palace power sat King Adebayo, a man loved by the people, praised on social media, respected by politicians, and admired for leading Ilorun city into modern success. Yet behind the smiles, cameras, and royal waves was a human heart that still struggled with desire, loneliness, and weakness. Because no matter how high a person rises, temptation has a way of climbing even higher. That evening, as the city lights came alive and the palace prepared for another calm night, none of them knew that a small, unseen crack had already formed inside the palace walls, a crack that would soon grow wider, louder, and more painful. Because as people say these days, not every danger makes noise when it enters your life. Some arrive quietly and grow while you are smiling. And it was right there, in that quiet moment of peace, respect, and routine, that the first step toward a secret was unknowingly taken. A step that would test love, power, tradition, and the strength of a woman against both a man and society itself, as the night slowly wrapped Ilorun city in darkness and waited for what morning would bring. Morning came quickly in Ilorun city, and before the sun fully woke up, the palace was already alive with movement, footsteps, whispered greetings, and the soft sound of brooms touching shiny floors. Because palace life never truly rested, and the maids understood that their day began long before the city outside opened its eyes. The maids lived in a small shared building behind the palace, far from the royal rooms, far from luxury, and far from attention. And every morning they dressed in the same simple uniforms, tied their hair neatly, and reminded themselves that inside the palace, silence was safety, obedience was protection, and questions could be dangerous because the palace was a place where power spoke louder than truth. Among these maids was Zainab, a young woman who came from a crowded part of the city where houses stood too close to each other and dreams often had no space to grow. And she had accepted palace work not because it was easy, but because it was better than hunger, better than sleeping with worry, and better than watching her future fade before it even started. Zainab worked harder than many others, not because she wanted praise, but because she wanted to disappear into her work, believing that if no one noticed her, no trouble would find her. And as she cleaned royal rooms, carried trays, and bowed her head when elders passed, she repeated in her heart what her mother once told her, that in a place where you have no power, wisdom is knowing how to survive quietly. Life among the maids was not always kind, because jealousy lived close to hunger, gossip walked faster than truth, and fear tied everyone's mouth tight. Yet Zainab stayed away from arguments and laughter, choosing instead to finish her duties and retreat into silence, unaware that sometimes silence does not protect you from the eyes of those who hold power. That afternoon, as Zainab walked through one of the palace corridors carrying freshly cleaned linens, she felt something change in the air. Not a sound, not a voice, but a strange heaviness that made her steps slow down, and when she lifted her eyes for just a second, she saw King Adebayo standing at a distance, speaking with one of his aides, and even though she quickly bowed and looked away, something unseen had already happened. The king did not say a word, and Zainab did not hear her name called, yet from that moment a quiet line had been drawn between their lives, one she did not ask for and one she did not understand. Because power often notices without warning, and when it does, the weaker side usually finds out too late. As evening returned and the maids gathered quietly after work, Zainab felt tired in a way she could not explain, as if her heart was carrying a weight her hands never touched. And while the city outside continued its noise and rush, inside the palace, something small but dangerous had begun to grow, proving that sometimes the biggest troubles begin on a day that looks exactly like every other day. And with that silent ending to an ordinary day, Zainab went to sleep, not knowing that her life had just taken its first step away from safety, and that the palace she believed would protect her might soon become the place that would test her more than the streets she once feared. That night, while Ilọrun city refused to sleep and lights from tall buildings shone through the palace windows, King Adebayo sat alone in his private room, scrolling through messages, listening to distant traffic, and pretending that his mind was calm, even though it was not, because power may silence many problems. But it does not silence desire, and the king slowly realized that his thoughts kept returning to a face that was never meant to live in his mind. He tried to push the thought away by reminding himself of who he was. A king in a modern city, a man watched by millions, a husband to Queen Adesewa and a symbol of honor to the people, yet the more he reminded himself of duty, the louder temptation spoke. Because as people now say, the heart does not always respect titles. The next day, the palace moved as usual. Meetings were held, visitors arrived, cameras flashed, and advisors praised the king's leadership. But in between all this noise, King Adebayo's eyes searched quietly, not loudly, not openly, but with the patience of someone who had already decided something deep inside, even if he had not yet admitted it to himself. Zainab, on the other hand, felt uneasy without knowing why, as if someone had placed a soft but heavy hand on her spirit. And as she worked, she noticed that guards stepped aside more quickly when she passed certain halls, and senior maids redirected her duties without explanation. Changes that looked small but carried meaning, because in the palace, nothing happened by accident. When King Adebayo finally spoke to Zainab, it was not dramatic or loud. It was calm, polite, and wrapped in authority, asking her simple questions about her work, her background, and her comfort in the palace. And even though his voice was gentle, Zainab's heart beat fast, because she knew that when power speaks kindly, it often expects silence in return. She answered carefully, choosing her words like fragile glass, bowing her head and reminding herself that respect was her shield. But inside her, fear and confusion fought each other because she did not understand why the king's attention felt heavy instead of honorable. As days passed, these small conversations continued, never too long, never too close, yet always crossing invisible lines, and King Adebayo began to enjoy the feeling of being seen without responsibility, while Zainab struggled with the pressure of being noticed without protection, proving that what feels like kindness to the powerful can feel like danger to the weak. Queen Adesewa noticed nothing at first, because her days were filled with duties, public appearances, and the weight of representing stability in a city that changed every second, and she trusted the palace, trusted her husband, and trusted the walls that had protected royalty for generations. By the end of that week, King Adebayo stood at a crossroads he pretended not to see, knowing that one step forward would change everything, and one step back would cost him nothing but desire. Yet instead of turning away, he allowed the moment to grow, unaware or unwilling to accept that the greatest battles are not fought in public, but inside the quiet places of the heart. And as the palace lights dimmed again, the city waited silently because something fragile had already begun to bend under the weight of choice. From the moment King Adebayo crossed the line in his heart, the palace no longer felt the same, because what once looked ordinary now carried meaning, and what once felt safe now felt watched, as if the walls themselves had learned how to listen, and every step taken in silence echoed louder than words. The king began to arrange his movements carefully, using late meetings, sudden schedule changes, and trusted aides to create moments where eyes would not follow too closely. And in a city where people believed technology revealed everything, he relied on the oldest trick of power, which was knowing that most people only saw what they were allowed to see. Zainab did not ask for these moments, yet she found herself pulled into them, being called to deliver things that could wait, being asked to assist in places she had never worked before, and each time she felt fear tighten around her chest, because deep inside she knew that her life was slowly walking into a place with no clear exit. When they finally spoke in private, the king's words were soft, careful, and filled with promises that sounded harmless. Words about understanding, protection, and appreciation, and even though Zainab wanted to believe that respect still existed between them, her heart warned her that respect does not hide in shadows. She tried to remind herself that she was only a maid, that society would never ask her side of the story, and that if anything went wrong, blame would not knock gently before entering her life. Yet fear does not always give strength, because sometimes fear becomes a door that leads people exactly where they should not go. King Adebayo, wrapped in power and confidence, told himself that he was in control, that nothing would change, and that secrets could be managed like everything else in the palace, forgetting that human hearts do not follow royal rules and consequences do not respect rank. As their secret meetings continued, Zainab's sleep became restless. Her laughter faded, and her silence grew heavier because she was fighting not just her conscience, but society itself. A society that forgives powerful men quickly and punishes powerless women loudly. And in those quiet moments, she learned a painful truth that, in a world of uneven power, love is never equal. Outside the palace, Ilọrun city continued to shine with progress. Billboards spoke of success, social media praised leadership, and people admired the royal family, unaware that behind the palace gates, tradition was being broken carefully, slowly, and dangerously. Queen Adesewa still moved with grace, unaware that trust was being cut behind her back, and the palace still smiled for cameras, even as a secret grew stronger in the dark, waiting patiently because secrets do not rush, they wait until the moment they can cause the most damage. By the end of that season, the line between right and wrong had fully disappeared for the king, while Zainab stood trapped between fear and obedience, learning too late that some paths feel quiet at first because they are leading you into storms. And as the palace lights dimmed again, fate closed in gently, knowing it had already been invited inside. Time moved forward the way it always does, slowly but without mercy, and while Ilọrun city stayed loud and busy, something quiet but heavy was happening inside Zainab's body. Something she tried to ignore at first, something she prayed was only tiredness or stress, because accepting the truth felt more frightening than denying it. Zainab noticed the changes little by little, how her body felt weaker in the mornings, how smells made her uncomfortable, how her heart raced with fear even when she was standing still, and each day she told herself that it would pass, that she was only overthinking because in a place like the palace, truth was dangerous, and hope often felt safer than reality. But reality does not stay hidden for long. And one morning, as Zainab stood alone in the maid's quarters, staring at her reflection, the truth finally stood before her clearly, and her knees almost gave way, because she understood that she was pregnant, carrying a life she never planned for, in a world that would never protect her. Fear wrapped around her like a tight rope, squeezing her breath because she knew what society would say, she knew how quickly blame would fall on her shoulders, and she knew that the same palace that smiled during celebrations could turn cold and cruel without warning, because society is often gentle to the powerful and harsh to the weak. When Zainab told King Adebayo, his face changed in ways she had never seen before, moving from shock to silence, then to deep worry. And even though he spoke words of reassurance, promising that he would handle everything, his eyes revealed fear, because for the first time the secret was no longer something he could hide in meetings and schedules. The king began to feel the weight of his actions pressing hard on his chest, because this was no longer just desire or secrecy. This was life, responsibility, and consequence. And while he worried about reputation, power, and public image, Zainab worried about survival, safety, and the child growing quietly inside her. Every day became a challenge for Zainab as she tried to hide her body, control her movements, and silence her emotions, knowing that the palace watched everything, and even the smallest mistake could expose her, and in her heart she repeated the same question again and again, wondering why the burden of shame always grows heavier on women's backs. Queen Adesewa still walked through the palace with confidence, greeting people, attending events, and trusting the home she believed was built on loyalty. Yet sometimes she felt a strange discomfort she could not explain, like a quiet warning knocking gently at her spirit, because the heart often senses betrayal before the eyes can see it. As the days passed, whispers began to float softly among the maids, small looks exchanged, sudden silences when Zainab entered a room. And even though no one spoke openly, tension filled the air, because secrets have a way of changing how people breathe around you. By the end of that season, Zainab understood that her life would never return to what it once was, and that the child she carried was already shaping her destiny. While the palace continued to shine proudly before the world, unaware that beneath its beauty, a truth was growing stronger, heavier, and closer to the surface, waiting for the moment it could no longer be hidden. As weeks passed, the palace of Ilọrun no longer breathed with the same ease it once had, because even though nothing had been announced and no truth had been spoken aloud, tension settled into the halls like heavy air before a storm, making smiles feel forced and silence feel louder than noise. Zainab's body continued to change, and no matter how carefully she dressed or how slowly she moved, the effort of hiding the truth drained her strength, because carrying a secret inside the body is far more exhausting than carrying it in the heart. And every step she took felt like walking on a thin line between safety and exposure. The other maids noticed, not because Zainab wanted attention, but because change cannot stay invisible forever, and even though no one dared to ask her questions directly, their eyes spoke enough, filled with curiosity, fear, and quiet judgment, reminding her that society watches closely when a woman's life begins to shift outside accepted rules. King Adebayo became restless, moving through the palace with growing impatience, holding meetings that led nowhere, snapping at aides who made small mistakes, and losing sleep over thoughts of consequences, because power may protect for a time, but it cannot erase the truth once it begins to breathe. Queen Adesewa felt the change most deeply, not in clear facts, but in emotions that refused to settle, as she noticed her husband growing distant, the palace energy turning cold, and whispers floating where laughter once lived. And even though she tried to dismiss these feelings, her heart refused to be quiet, because when trust is breaking, the soul feels it before proof arrives. One evening, during a public palace event filled with music, cameras, and polite smiles, Queen Adesewa watched King Adebayo closely and noticed how his eyes avoided hers and how his attention drifted too often toward the servant's side. And in that moment, doubt planted itself firmly in her heart, growing roots she could no longer pull out. Zainab, standing among the maids that night, felt trapped between fear and exhaustion, knowing that every breath, every movement, and every glance could expose her. And she realized that silence was no longer protecting her, it was slowly isolating her. Because secrets do not only hide truth, they separate people. As days turned into nights, the palace elders began to sense that something was wrong, noticing changes in behavior, routine, and harmony, because tradition teaches that when balance is disturbed, truth is not far behind, and their quiet observations added more pressure to a situation already close to breaking. By the end of that period, Ilọrun Palace stood like a house built on shaking ground, appearing strong to outsiders but fragile within, as every person involved carried their own fear, guilt, and suspicion, knowing deep down that the truth was no longer asking permission to come out. It was already finding its way forward, step by step, toward a moment that would change everything. The day the truth finally broke through Queen Adesewa's heart did not arrive with shouting or public shame, but with a quiet heaviness that refused to leave her. Because some discoveries do not come like thunder, they come like slow rain that soaks everything before you realize you are already wet. Queen Adesewa had always trusted her instincts, and now those instincts followed her closely as she moved through the palace, noticing how conversations stopped when she appeared, how the maids avoided her eyes, and how the air itself felt tense, as if the palace was holding its breath. waiting for her to ask the one question everyone feared. That afternoon, while reviewing palace matters, the Queen's attention drifted again and again to the same pattern: the sudden reassignment of duties, the unusual protection around one maid, and the way her husband's name appeared quietly but repeatedly around these changes. And in that moment, the truth began to form, not as a story told by others, but as a picture her own mind was putting together piece by painful piece. When Queen Adesewa finally saw Zainab up close, standing quietly with lowered eyes and a body that could no longer hide its secret, time seemed to slow down, and the Queen felt something tear inside her. Because betrayal hurts deepest when it comes from within the walls you believed were safe. She did not shout, she did not faint, and she did not cause a scene, because pain does not always need noise to be powerful. And instead she walked away with dignity, carrying a storm inside her chest, realizing that love, trust, and respect had all been wounded at once. That evening, when the palace was quiet and the city lights glowed outside, Queen Adesewa stood before King Adebayo and asked him the question her heart already knew the answer to. And in that silence that followed, when excuses failed and words collapsed, the truth finally stood naked between them. The king tried to explain, tried to soften his mistake with promises and regret, but Queen Adesewa listened with a heart breaking in slow motion, understanding that this was not just about another woman, but about power used wrongly, trust destroyed carelessly, and a system that allowed silence to protect wrongdoing. Zainab, alone in her room that night, felt the weight of the Queen's discovery press down on her soul, knowing that no matter what happened next, she would carry society's judgment heavier than the man who caused the pain, because when truth comes out, it does not land equally on everyone. By the time dawn approached, Ilọrun Palace was no longer the same place it had been the night before, because a truth once hidden had finally stepped into the light, and with it came heartbreak, anger, and the beginning of consequences that would test tradition, justice, and the strength of a woman standing against both a man and the world around her. When morning finally came, it did not bring peace to Ilọrun Palace, but instead carried a heavy seriousness that settled into every corner. Because once truth is known, silence can no longer protect anyone, and the palace understood that what happened was no longer a private matter, but a public wound that demanded attention. Queen Adesewa did not hide or break down in front of others, because she knew that in a society quick to blame women and excuse men, showing weakness would only invite more judgment. So she stood tall and called for the palace elders, the same elders who guarded tradition, law, and moral balance in a city that often forgot its roots. The elders gathered in the great hall, men and women who had seen many seasons of life, and as they listened to the unfolding truth, the room filled with tension, because this was not a simple mistake. It was a matter of power misused, trust broken, and royal dignity placed in danger, and every decision they made would speak loudly to the entire city. Zainab was brought forward, her hands trembling and her eyes heavy with fear, and even before anyone spoke, she could feel judgment pressing on her like weight. Because society often asks women to explain their pain, while allowing powerful men to explain their mistakes, and in that moment she realized that truth does not always bring fairness. King Adebayo stood before the elders as well, no longer the confident leader praised online, but a man facing the consequences of his actions. And while some elders spoke of discipline and responsibility, others worried about public image, political stability, and the kingdom's reputation, proving that justice often struggles when power feels threatened. Queen Adesewa finally spoke, her voice calm but firm, reminding everyone that tradition was not created to protect wrongdoing, but to protect balance, dignity, and the weak, and her words carried the pain of betrayal and the strength of a woman who refused to be silent, showing that true leadership speaks even when the heart is breaking. Outside the palace walls, rumors spread fast through social media, street conversations, and news headlines, turning private pain into public entertainment, and Ilọrun City watched closely, choosing sides, judging quickly, and proving once again that society loves stories of downfall more than stories of healing. Zainab felt herself standing alone against not just the palace, but the entire city, realizing that her struggle was no longer only personal, but a reflection of how society treats women caught in the mistakes of powerful men, And in her heart she understood that sometimes the hardest battle is not against one person, but against the voice of the crowd. As the elders delayed their final decision, the palace remained suspended in uncertainty, with every person waiting for judgment, punishment, or mercy, knowing that whatever came next would not only change 3 lives, but would also reveal what Ilọrun Kingdom truly stood for in a modern world watching closely. Days passed after the elders' gathering, but peace did not return to Ilọrun Palace because judgment delayed is still judgment waiting. And for Zainab, every new morning felt heavier than the last, as if time itself was pressing down on her shoulders, reminding her that society rarely rushes to protect the weak. Zainab was moved away from the palace rooms and placed in a quiet, guarded section, not for comfort, but for control. And though the king said it was for her safety, she understood that it was also to hide the problem until a decision could be announced, proving again that power often calls control by the name of care. Her body grew heavier with pregnancy, and so did her heart, because she worried not only about herself, but about the child growing inside her. A child who had done nothing wrong, yet already carried the weight of shame, silence, and social judgment. And in those lonely hours, she learned that innocence does not protect you in a world ruled by reputation. King Adebayo continued his public duties, appearing calm, smiling for cameras, and speaking confidently at events. And while some criticized him online, many defended him, calling his actions a mistake, a moment of weakness, or something private, showing clearly how society bends its rules when power is involved. Queen Adesewa watched all of this with quiet pain, feeling betrayed not only by her husband, but by the system that tried to reduce her pain into a background issue. And though her heart was broken, something inside her began to change, because she realized that silence would only allow the same injustice to repeat itself. When the elders finally announced their decision, it carried the weight of compromise rather than true justice, focusing on protecting the kingdom's image while offering limited consequences. And in that moment, Zainab understood that her life would be reshaped, not by truth, but by convenience. Yet something unexpected happened within her, because instead of breaking completely, Zainab found a quiet strength rising, a strength built from survival, motherhood, and the understanding that even when society turns away, dignity can still be claimed from within. She decided that no matter where life placed her next, she would protect her child with honesty, courage, and resilience, refusing to pass down fear as inheritance, because the future does not belong only to the powerful, it belongs to those who refuse to give up. As Ilọrun City continued its noise and distractions, 3 lives stood at different crossroads, the king clinging to power, the queen finding her voice, and the maid learning to stand tall against a world that tried to push her down, while the unborn child waited quietly, carrying the hope that transformation can rise even from injustice. Time did what no judgment could do. It moved forward and forced everyone to live with the results of their choices. And as Ilọrun City continued to grow louder, faster, and more modern, the palace learned that some wounds do not heal by being hidden, they heal by being faced. Queen Adesewa did not remain the same woman she was before the truth came out, because pain reshaped her, not into bitterness, but into clarity. And she slowly began to use her position not just as a queen beside a king, but as a voice for fairness, openly supporting reforms that protected women, workers, and the powerless, proving that betrayal can either silence a person or awaken them. King Adebayo remained on the throne, but something important had changed, because respect no longer came easily, and every public appearance carried quiet judgment, teaching him a lesson no advisor ever could, that power without integrity is loud but empty, and that a crown does not erase consequences, it only delays them. Zainab's life took a different path than the one she entered the palace with, because she left quietly, without celebration or apology, carrying her child and her dignity with her, choosing to rebuild away from the walls that almost destroyed her. And even though the city did not clap for her strength, she learned that survival does not need applause to be meaningful. When her child was born, Zainab looked into the small, innocent face and understood that the past no longer had power over her future, because transformation does not always happen by changing the world. Sometimes it happens by refusing to let the world change your heart. Ilọrun City eventually moved on, as cities always do, chasing new stories and new scandals. But the lesson remained for those willing to see it. that society often tests women harder, forgives men faster, and protects power more than truth. Yet real change begins when someone refuses to stay silent. The palace still stood tall among modern buildings, shining as before, but inside it carried a story that would be told quietly for years. A story about love misused, trust broken, and strength discovered in unexpected places, reminding everyone that character is revealed not when life is easy, but when it becomes unfair. And so the tale of Ilorun Palace did not end with perfect justice or simple happiness, but with growth, awareness, and the understanding that even in a world ruled by power and noise, courage can rise softly and still change everything. Because in the end, the true measure of a society is how it treats those with the least power when mistakes are made.